Good morning, everybody. My name is Janie Montblanc, and with me is John Tull, acting Sagebrush Ecosystem Coordinator with the U.S. Geological Survey Land Management Research Program, and Corey Gooker, co-coordinator of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange. We'd like to welcome you to the fifth and final webinar in the Sagebrush Ecosystem Restoration and Fire Science series on the topic of fire and fuels, presented by USGS researchers. John Toll will be our host today, but before I hand the webinar over to him, I will go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom Meeting as our platform with attendees' mics and cameras off. We will take a couple of questions after each presentation and address additional questions at the end if time is permitting. Please type your questions in the chat and John will field them to the presenters. Any questions we don't get to, we'll follow up with the speakers afterward and provide responses along with the video recording. With that, I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you, Janae. I appreciate it. And I appreciate the support that the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange is providing for our SURF webinar series. This series has been an ongoing collaboration with the BLM and other partners. And our goal with SURF is to provide meaningful and actionable science for our partners. And these webinars give us an opportunity for tech transfer where our researchers and you all, the managers, have an opportunity to see science updates from them and ask questions and learn more about it. So we have 5 speakers today. And as Janae mentioned, we'll probably go to a panel session at the end if we have time for that, and we'll take some questions in between. So please do use the chat to put any questions you might have for any of our speakers today. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started and hand it off to Adam. Adam Noel is going to talk about PJ treatments for minimizing climate and fire vulnerability. So Adam, I see you.
Can you hear me as well?
I hear you and I see your slides. Take it away.
All right. Excellent. Thank you, John, and thank you, Janine, for hosting and inviting all of us to this presentation to share results. Yeah, excited to be here. My name is Adam. I'm a postdoc researcher working with John Bradford out of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And today I'm going to share the work that we've been doing on a literature review focused on soil moisture response to treatments in pinyon juniper woodlands. And I have some excellent co-authors on this project across the USGS, the BLM, Forest Service, and other universities listed here. And I'd also like to acknowledge our funding from the BLM and also from the USGS Ecosystems Mission Area. Okay, so why conduct this literature review on pinyon juniper woodlands? Just some background, PJ are a very widespread and important ecosystem type across the western US, and they're managed for a variety of objectives, including wildfire mitigation or habitat restoration. And to meet these management objectives, treatments are typically enacted as tree removals, so removing tree biomass to reduce fire intensity or risk of fire spread, or removing trees to promote other vegetation, such as sagebrush or grass species. However, there may also be utility to improve tree drought resilience via changes in tree density and subsequent changes in soil moisture. So thinning trees or reducing stand density has been shown to alter soil moisture conditions in other forest types, but it's unclear whether tree density reductions will have the same effects in pinyon juniper woodlands. And additionally, because pinyon juniper woodlands span such a large geographic gradient, it may be that treatments applied in different locations may result in different moisture outcomes, which makes it difficult to use treatments to meet your goals if you aren't certain how site conditions will respond. And so the major goal of this project is to try to improve our understanding of pinyon juniper treatment outcomes and how treatments may alter soil moisture conditions, both for vegetation benefits, trees and other vegetation, and also fire risk reduction benefits. To achieve this, we conducted a literature review, searched for studies that included important pinyon juniper species, so Pinus edulis and Monophylla, and 4 junipers, Juniperus osteosperma, Monosperma occidentalis, and Dapiana. And the studies must have had a treatment occur, either mechanical tree removals like mastication, cut and leaving, or cut and removing it, or treatments as a prescribed burn or utilizing natural burn boundaries. And then finally, the study must have measured soil moisture across their treatment and control plots or from before and after treatments. And so this resulted in a pool of 28 publications, which we then grouped to 15 experiments, because many of these publications used the same experimental treatment and set of sites. We collected information from these publications on the experiment location, which tree species were treated, what treatment type was used and when it was applied, soil moisture response, and where the moisture measurement was taken and when. So using all of that collected information, we assessed soil moisture response as it was related to several common factors among publications. So at what soil depth were moisture responses observed? In what season? Did the response change over time? And did it vary by treatment type? And then we next characterized the spatial distribution of experiments. And finally, we assessed patterns in moisture response across two climate gradients that are known to influence pinyon juniper trees. So monsoonality, or the proportion of rainfall arriving in summer months, which drives species distributions at these large scales, and also aridity, or the amount of dryness influencing vegetation and atmospheric demand for moisture. So getting into our results here, first we can see that the distribution of experiments in our review indicated as letters on these maps with background colors of aridity, panel A, and monsoonality in panel B. And so it's easier to think on the middle panel, easier to see, I think, that these maps also have a semi-transparent buffer that indicates areas of pinyon juniper woodlands. So all those completely transparent areas. And among all these areas where pinyon juniper species reside, you can see that the experiments cover a large area, but there's still many locations that are not represented. So for example, the whole state of Arizona only had one experiment conducted within its boundaries. And the state of Nevada is represented by just two experiments, one of them with multiple sites. And you can also see there's many areas in New Mexico that lack coverage, as well as eastern Utah. And so next we can see how those studies represent climate space in aridity and monsoonality gradients. Panel C is showing a heat map of climate conditions that's extracted from all of these areas covered by the buffer in our maps. So again, all those completely transparent areas where pinyon juniper occurs, we plot a density heat map of those climate conditions in panel C. And again, we can see that studies are pretty well representative of several commonly occurring climate conditions for pinyon juniper woodlands. However, locations that experience moderate to high monsoonality are less represented, and studies conducted in highly arid conditions are also lacking, as well as studies in the margins of pinyon juniper climate space, or kind of these leading and trailing edges of pinyon juniper ecosystems. So that's kind of how the experiments are distributed. And now we're getting into the details of experiments, comparing how moisture response is related to different experiment conditions. And so I'm showing here the full table that is going to be in our manuscript, but I'm going to talk through just a simplified version that shows just a proportion of experiments as related to each question. So for example, the first question we assessed, how do treatments affect soil moisture? Just a very basic moisture response direction. And so our table is showing 10 experiments observed soil moisture increases in response to treatment. 7 observed decreased soil moisture in response to treatment. That's in that red color. And 10 observed no moisture response to treatment. And because many of these experiments were conducted across multiple years or multiple sites, we allow each experiment to provide support for multiple moisture response directions. So a single experiment could provide support for increasing moisture in response to treatment or decreasing if they have observed these different responses at different times. And so our next question was to ask at what soil depth moisture responses were observed. And you can see that we grouped responses to 0 to 10, 0 to 30, and then deeper than 30 centimeters depths. So there is some overlap in those first two. And that's because of the wide variability in where experiments buried their moisture sensors and how they report their results. So in surface soil horizons up to 30 centimeters of depth, experiments observed a pretty even distribution of responses. There were as many responses or observations of decreasing soil moisture as there were of increases in soil moisture in response to treatment. However, at deeper soil horizons, although there were fewer total observations across experiments, they're more consistent in observing moisture gains or no moisture response after treatment, never observing decreased moisture in response to treatment below 30 centimeters. So next we assessed when moisture response was observed across seasons. So experiments observed mixed moisture responses across all seasons, and there's no really overwhelming trend to see. But results do suggest that moisture response may be more variable in the summer, and the chance of negative moisture responses to treatment may be less in non-summer seasons. So I have three more questions that we tallied support for, but each one of these has far less support in the literature than our earlier questions. So here we're asking, among experiments that implemented both mechanical and burn treatment types, was moisture response larger from either of those treatment types? And more experiments found that soil moisture response was larger from mechanical treatments than from burn treatments, but two found that burn treatments resulted in larger moisture responses than mechanical treatments, and only one found that there's really no difference among those treatment types. Among experiments that measured moisture response to treatment across multiple years, most found that the magnitude of treatment effects decreases with time, and just one study found that treatment effects increased over time. And this was a result of post-burn recovery, where after a year after that treatment was implemented as a burn, moisture response was larger than it was previously. And finally, also among multi-year experiments, we assessed how precipitation relative to long-term averages influenced moisture response. So there's two options here. Was it a drier than normal year, or was it wetter than normal? And we found that in dry years, treatments either enhanced moisture benefits, so treatments increased the amount of moisture as available, or it exacerbated moisture deficits. So either way, dry years amplify the moisture response, either resulting in more moisture as a result of treatment or resulting in a drier site as a result of treatment. Just amplify the direction either way. And while in wet years, we found less moisture differences between treatments and controls. So in other words, wet years suppress the effects of treatments, likely because there's enough precip to saturate the soil regardless of tree density. And so finally, we plotted these moisture responses by their experiments' climate conditions, and we did this to see if there's difference in climate setting where positive or negative moisture responses are observed. And what we found is that the data may suggest some separation along a monsoonality gradient, so that x-axis, but there really just isn't enough data to statistically test. So the experiments we gathered vary in how they measure soil moisture, their climate setting, the intensity of their treatments, and there's just too much variability across the experiments to be able to account for these biases and confounders. And so overall, this is suggesting that there's factors that drive soil moisture other than broad climate patterns, likely local site conditions. And moisture responses are slightly more separated along monsoonality than along that aridity gradient. In contrast, moisture responses overlap a fair amount on our aridity gradient, possibly suggesting that aridity doesn't have much of an influence on moisture response, or just that we need more experiments in highly arid locations to observe those variable moisture responses. And so in summary, our results primarily suggest that moisture response to treatments is highly variable and that removing trees doesn't consistently result in moisture gains for the remaining vegetation. So we need more studies to fill in some of these knowledge gaps, particularly in geographic space across Arizona, Nevada, and New Mexico, but also in climate space in highly arid or in high monsoonality areas. But despite all that uncertainty across these publications, we found that soil moisture gains are more likely below 30 centimeters depth, that treatments may result in the highest variability in moisture responses in the summer, that dry years have amplifying effects, either enhancing moisture gains or exacerbating moisture losses, and that moisture response may vary across the monsoonality gradient, but more studies are needed here too. All right, and that's all I have. I'll note that the manuscript is in prep, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Adam. I think we have time for one question. I don't see any in the chat. Oh, there's one that just came up. So from Stella, she's asked, do you think some of your results or separation is due to the difference in species water use, particularly juniper versus pinyon?
That's a great question, Stella. Yeah, some of the studies, as you might have remembered from that map, there's a big clump of studies up in the western juniper kind of area in Oregon. That's where a lot of the kind of insights are coming from, where a lot of like the sage step sites are as well. So where people are kind of using treatments for other objectives, and those findings kind of inform how we've been thinking about treatments in other places. Even though a lot of the research is done just with Western juniper, yeah, it may have very different responses in other ecosystems or where other species, other opinions are present. So that's something we try and explore a little bit more in the manuscript, talking about where certain species are being treated. But yeah, that's a great question. We're still kind of exploring.
Well, thank you, Adam. Appreciate your updates.
Thank you.
So we'll be moving on now to Cara Applestein, who's going to present predicting reburn risk to restoration investments. So Cara, I see you. You see your
Great.
slides. And
Can you hear me?
Yep, take it away.
All right. So this research we did predicting reburn risk to restoration investments now has quite a few different components to it. So I'm going to try to present as much of this research as I can within 10 minutes. So as wildfires increase in size and severity in the Western United States, it's becoming increasingly common for areas that burn once to experience reburning within a fairly short period of time. So seeding and herbicide treatments across BLM lands are pretty extensive, and a prior study found that nearly a fourth of those seeding treatments fully or partially reburned over a 30-year period of time. So post-fire treatments, they do represent a significant investment, and thus we need more information to understand whether these treatments affect the likelihood of the landscape reburning or the way that fire moves across the landscape. And then we also need to understand when the treatments do reburn, is that investment lost or has it buffered the landscape against poor outcomes? So reburning areas may be a lot different depending on what treatments were done there and what the fuels look like. Because sagebrush don't resprout, if those areas do burn, especially if they do have a large invasive grass understory, they might be really fire intolerant and pretty susceptible to invasion after that reburning. On the other hand, if post-fire restoration was pretty successful at establishing dominant deep-rooted perennial bunchgrass species, especially those included in drill seed mixes that can quickly resprout after fire, they may be fairly resilient to reburning and may be able to resist invasion if a reburn does happen. So we had three primary objectives for this. First, to understand the effects of treatments that occurred after one fire, so drill seeding, herbicide, or aerial shrub seeding, how those affected the fuel types before an area might reburn. And then to compare the burn probability on treated or untreated landscapes under different weather scenarios. And then finally, assuming that a reburn does happen, to assess the survival of established bunch grasses and understand how the community composition changes as a result of reburning and if it is resilient to reburning. So in order to do this work, we are somewhat limited to the tools that we have available. The primary tool that we have available for modeling burn probability is FlamMap. And FlamMap is designed with pretty coarse fuel categories, many of which were designed for forest. And so we had to type our fuels and sagebrush steppe to the specific fuel types that exist within the FlamMap burn model for us to be able to parameterize those. So these are an example of the different fuel types that we have in sagebrush steppe. There are these GR1, GR2, GR4. This is basically grass fuel models that are on a gradient from very low fuel to higher fuels. There's a grass shrub component, or grass shrub types, GS1, GS2, mixed grass and shrub. And then there is more of a dominant shrub type, a shrub 1 or a shrub 2. So I'm just using this so that you are familiar with the fuel types when we start talking about them later and how the fuel types changed. We had an empirical component to the study and a simulative component to the study. So there were 13 burn landscapes that we used for assessing the treatment effects from fuels on field data. So looking at areas that had these treatments on them and seeing how the fuels compared between treated and untreated areas from empirical field data. And then we took 3 of those specific landscapes, so Craters of the Moon National Monument, Snowstorm, fire in northern Nevada, and then the Soda wildfire, which reburned in the Jump Fire in 2024, and ran burn simulations comparing a treated scenario, which was a realistic scenario of what actually happened on the landscape, versus a untreated scenario, which we created after we understood what the effects of treatments were on the fuels, and compared how the fire was likely to burn those areas in the two different fuels scenarios. And then lastly, for the one site, the Soda, we had 200 established plots there that actually reburned in the 2024 Jump Fire. So we had information about the species composition before it reburned, and then we were able to go back and look at the species composition after it reburned. And so we assessed how the bunch grasses that were established on that fire survived as a result of a reburn, and how the community composition changed. So this is the treatment effects on the fuel types. So for drill seeding, we can see that drill seeding increased the prevalence of GR2. So that's a little bit denser grass fuel type. Herbicide increased the prevalence of GR1. So that's basically reducing the fuels on these landscapes. And then shrub seedings tended to slightly increase the GR2s and slightly increase the GS2. So more grasses, more grass shrub types. Since herbicide and seedings were usually paired together, the cumulative effect of treatment was generally an increase in grass or grass shrub fuel types. So small to moderate increases in GR2 to GS2, because there was not really that many cases where herbicide was applied without also having some sort of seeding treatment as well. Sorry, there we go. So this is an example of a difference in burn probability between treated and untreated scenarios. So this is showing basically if you take the treated scenario and subtract out the untreated scenario, you get more or less probability of burning. So the red area shows where there's a little bit higher increased risk of burning. And we really didn't see much of the landscape showing wildfire spread at all in weather scenarios that were below the 50th percentile of this hot, dry, windy index. So that's just a metric we used to determine our different weather scenarios. In these increased weather extremes and in 95th or higher percentile of the hot, dry, windy index, we did see a little bit increased risk of burning in the treated scenario compared to the untreated scenario. And you can see that risk actually expanded a little bit outside of the area that was treated. So the dashed lines are areas that were treated. So the burn risk increased a little bit outside of that area. And these patterns held for other landscapes in which we simulated burn risk, basically just a little bit increased risk in those more extreme weather scenarios. My computer does not want to go forward. Okay. So it's one thing to have a higher risk of reburning, but then we also want to understand how previously burned and treated landscapes do respond to reburning. So as I mentioned, we had these plots on the Soda wildfire that reburned. We tagged bunch grasses right after fire, and then we revisited in the summer to assess how they survived. This burn that occurred, the 2024 Jump Fire, was a pretty low intensity burn. It didn't burn that hot. Soils were mostly brown after that fire. And we found that the bunch grass survival was really high. So on average, there was about 90% survival of bunch grasses. And we did see that survival was higher in microsites that were where the soil color was brown, which means it was lower intensity area as compared to areas that were black or gray, which was a little bit higher intensity. But even those bunch grasses in the black or gray soil still had well over 80% survival. We also saw that survival was higher for bunch grasses that were larger in basal diameter, and also for those that were in higher density plots as well, higher density of bunch grasses. We also looked at how the community composition changed as a result of reburning. So we compared the plots that did reburn with those that didn't. And we found that most of the community association types actually didn't really increase or decrease in relative abundance as a result of reburning. And this really notably included exotic annual grass types did not increase when the reburn occurred. We did find that there was a small reduction in the relative cover of the blue bunch wheatgrass association and an increase in the relative abundance of the Sandberg bluegrass association. This is not likely something that will endure for a long period of time because we have some other research that shows that there's kind of this momentary reduction in blue bunch wheatgrass, usually after fire, but that tends to rebound within like 1 to 2 years after fire. But a lot of these other community compositions were really pretty stable and didn't change that much as a result of reburning. So overall, we found that seeding treatments tended to slightly increase burn probability. So herbicides slightly reduced fuels, but it was often paired with seeding, so that increased the fuels. When there was more fuel under more extreme weather conditions, that usually resulted in higher probability of fire. But this finding also may reflect the fact that we didn't have a lot of categorical resolution in the fire behavior fuel models that we had to categorize as. You really can't distinguish much between the annual and perennial grasses. And there was also, we had an assumption that there was no interaction between fuel, moisture, and treatment. This might not actually be true. We could do some research in the future to see, if we do the treatments, does that actually maintain fuel moisture for longer into the year, which there's some previous research to suggest it might. Also, we found that the weather effects on fire behavior were stronger than any treatment effects. So treatment effects may slightly change the burn probability, but not as much as weather affects burn probability. And then lastly, we found that post-fire treatments that successfully established perennial bunchgrass communities, such in the Soto wildfire, showed pretty high resilience to low intensity reburning. This might be different story if an area burned at a much higher intensity, but for these areas that burned within the last 10 years, the fuel is going to be limited and probably less potential for high intensity burns. So future research could consider the interaction between treatment and fuel moisture, more extreme weather scenarios, and then we're all moving towards the physics-based fire simulation models with 3D fuels. So this paper, the Breaking the Grass Fire Cycle, that one's published, and then we have 2 more that are currently in review. Thank you.
Thank you, Cara. That's really interesting and a comprehensive study of what's available out there. And there's always, I guess, sample size challenges with work like this. I was wondering, in terms of those risk maps, the risk looked like it was relatively low in terms of reburn risk. But did you notice any geographic characteristics or other factors that may be worth considering for people that are going to do post-fire restoration? Like areas that probably are too risky to bother with?
Well, I think that because I was showing you the difference between the untreated and treated scenario, you weren't seeing like the absolute burn probability risk. So there was pretty high burn probability if you just looked at them individually without looking at the difference. I mean, I think areas that are probably a sagebrush with a large exotic annual grass understory would probably be very high risk because it's going to carry straight into the sagebrush and then you're going to get higher intensity fire.
Yeah. I think we'll have to take those questions. If you want to address those in the chat, we're going to go ahead and move on to Seth Munson's talk at this point. So thanks again. And Seth's going to talk about lessons from other ecosystems and using some remote sensing tools to explore fuel models and evaluations of past treatments. So Seth, I see your slides. I saw you, but I'm not.
See me?
And I'm hearing you, and I see you. Take it away, Seth.
Okay, thank you, John. Thanks everyone for the invite to talk to you all today. So I'm going to be talking about, my name's Seth Munson. I'm at USGS Southwest Biological Science Center. So I have a lot of overlap in the topical areas I study, but I'm primarily focused on the Colorado Plateau and warm deserts. So I think this is a great opportunity to maybe talk about some cross-pollination between our 2 regions and some lessons learned that we can share with each other. And today I'm going to be talking to you about our Fire Innovation Landscape Network. So a while back, the Wildland Fire Leadership Council recognized that the science, data, and technology has not kept pace with the extent of wildland fire and post-fire impacts, or been fully integrated into decision-making for fire, land, and community managers. So to address this need, we formed the Southwest Fire Innovation Landscape Network. So this is in close alignment with DOW, has these new innovation landscapes. Robert Arkell at USGS is working on one for Sagebrush. But I wanted to talk to you about our one in Arizona, where we're trying to address this need to prepare fire and natural resource managers for rapidly changing fire landscapes. So like you all in the SURF, we kind of do partner engagement, research and synthesis, and then training and decision support to kind of meet our management partners to develop new tools to help them evaluate fire risk and design fuel treatments. So we're primarily focused in central and southern Arizona. You can see some of the groups we work with, including tribes, wildlife refuges, parks. We do have quite a bit of work with BLM. And then I'm going to be talking to you today about some work we have with Fort Huachuca, which is an Army base right near the US-Mexico border. So really in our landscape, we're trying to develop these new tools and technologies to put them in the hands that you all are using to manage lands. And we're trying to rapidly deploy new technologies to make them more accessible for land management decision-making. So one of the tools that we have been using quite extensively is terrestrial LiDAR. So light detection and ranging renders a 3D structure of vegetation and fuels. So we wanted to put this to use and see if it could be used in a monitoring application. So we've been doing different sorts of projects to develop fuel metrics to assess fire risk, expand monitoring capability. So if we can get TLS to work, you can use a push button scan instead of unwinding measuring tape and doing Brown's transects and the kinds of stuff that takes a lot of time and resources in the field. So we think there can be a cost savings with some of these new technologies. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how we're evaluating fuel treatment effectiveness and a little bit more about scaling up. So one of the things that we wanted to test early on was whether or not this new technology would actually be comparable to fuel metrics that we would derive using traditional methods in the field. So what you can see here is that for total surface fuel load and canopy fuel load, our terrestrial LiDAR estimates are doing a pretty good job at predicting these two measurements. Now, the added benefit of using terrestrial LiDAR is you can actually get 3D structure. So here, what I'm showing you is a comparison between a traditional estimate of a vertical profile of fuel versus what we get with the TLS prediction. So you can see we're doing a pretty good job capturing that separation between the surface and the canopy, where we might have transition to kind of a more catastrophic fire situation. What we've developed at USGS, and this is largely Curtis Nelson at AROS, USGS AROS, is an interagency ecosystem LiDAR monitoring website, also called Intellimon. So here is a repository of 3D scans that people have gotten mostly in the Southeast, but we're building a pretty big database in Arizona. I think Matt Germino is going to be contributing to some more scans in the Sagebrush area. But basically, not only is this a repository for data, but it's an actual viewer of the scans and a way to get metrics related to veg structure and fuel. So for example, if you were to do a prescribed burn, you could get a scan before. So this is an oak savanna. You could get a scan afterwards and then get the metrics you would need for reporting just straight from the scans after some processing has happened. In addition, we're trying to build capacity to actually predict fire behavior or potential fire behavior from the scans. So we're working on a way to actually get fire behavior metrics based on the fuel structure and continuity. And then just to give you kind of a real world example of some of the stuff we've been doing, this is Fort Huachuca, again in southeastern Arizona or southern Arizona. It's very topographically complex terrain, includes a lot of PJ all the way up to mixed conifer, and then all the way down to the desert floor, primarily creosote bush shrubland and semi-arid grassland. So we did a bunch of scans and took some fuel measurements across the whole installation, including in these areas where they're actively doing fuel management, including mechanical treatments and prescribed burning. So we took a host of different measurements on different components of the fuel, along with our terrestrial LiDAR measurement. And what we're doing is we're bringing in remote sensing derived layers of vegetation and trying to scale up our estimates from the plot to the whole installation and sentinel landscape level. So importantly, Fort Huachuca, like many of you listening, sits in a place where there's a lot of cross-jurisdictional coordination on management. And so we also wanted to understand fuel across that larger landscape. So these are preliminary predictions of just the fine woody debris, one component of the fuels. We're working on predicting other sorts of components of the fuel. But what's really important in this landscape, as in your landscape, there's a lot of active fuel treatments going on. So this is just, these polygons are areas in the sentinel landscape and then the installation where they've actively employed fuel treatments. And so we want to understand changes that happen to the fuel because of these treatments. And so here you're seeing the change in, again, that fine woody debris between 2022 and 2025, where they've done various fuel treatments in wildfire. Everything that's blue is areas that have decreased in fuel. So in the active treated areas and an area that experienced wildfire. But importantly, we're trying to provide this information at very high spatial resolution to better help inform whether the treatments are effective. And then one last application is we've been running QuickFire, a 3D fuel model, or sorry, a 3D fire model to understand how these different treatments are affecting fire behavior. So here, for example, where they've implemented thinning and pile burning, we can see that in one veg type, the treatments have been successful in reducing potential canopy consumption. This area they have not, but in a different vegetation type, they've been quite successful in reducing fire risk. So we can try to understand the changes in fire behavior due to the fuel treatments. Finally, I'll just mention an emerging thing we're working on is that the Huachuca Mountains have experienced widespread tree mortality. Some of this is in the PJ. Some of it's higher up in the Ponderosa pine, Chihuahua pine communities. But we're developing new tools to accurately detect this dieback using remote sensing, because obviously this is a precursor to increased fire risk in this system. So with that, I'll stop and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate you sharing some of your lessons from a different landscape. Oops, and there's my timer going off. I wanted to see if there's any questions in the chat. It doesn't look like there are, but I was wondering, do you see the same potential for terrestrial LiDAR in shrubland-dominated systems as you do for woodlands and forests? You mentioned that Matt Germino's initiating some work in that ecosystem.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of work still to be done, but one thing that I think terrestrial lidar could do really well is capture the continuity of fuels. So when you think about cheatgrass fueled fires, a lot of what determines whether it continues or not is kind of if you have fuel or bare ground. And so I think for that particular application, it could do quite well. It's not the answer to everything. There's certain things it doesn't do well. Like for example, if you're in a thicker place with a lot of vegetation, you're going to have some occlusion issues. But I do think we've found some early successes in showing that it can work. But I think, again, we need to test it for sagebrush systems. And I think Matt's going to be working on that with some of his upcoming projects.
Great. Well, thanks for that. We'll talk some more probably about 3D models when we get to the panel. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce Jake Price, who's going to talk about new precision approaches for prioritizing fuel treatments. So Jake, I see you. I see your slides.
Can you hear me though?
And I hear you. Take it away.
Well, good morning, everyone. And yeah, thanks for inviting me to today's talks. My name is Samuel Price. I work with Matt Germino here at the USGS Fires Lab in Boise, Idaho. And today I'll be talking about precision approaches for prioritizing fuels treatments. Most of my work takes place in the semi-arid shrub steppe regions of the western U.S. So in case someone missed it, we'll talk a little bit about the problem. Shrublands across the western U.S. are increasingly being converted to annual grasslands through a reinforcing cycle of invasive grasses and wildfire. As the annual grasses expand, they create more continuous fine fuels, which promote larger and more frequent wildfires. Those fires then further reduce native shrubs and create conditions that favor annual grass invasion.
Jake, sorry, do you mind hitting that hide button? It's covering your slides up a little bit, that dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks for catching me, John. So yeah, this grass fire cycle here has spurred the installation of fuels treatments throughout the western U.S. So to better understand wildfire risk, managers have increasingly relied on wildfire simulation models to predict fire behavior and evaluate proactive management options. Raw thermal-based models are currently the most widely used for land management purposes. Examples of these are FlamMap and Behave Plus. Wildfire fuels in these raw thermal-based models are simplified into stylized representations, more commonly referred to as fire behavior fuel models. If you remember back to Cara's talk, she showed many examples of these fire behavior fuel models. And thankfully for us, maps of fire behavior fuel models are easily obtainable from Landfire, which produce and regularly update maps of fuels and vegetation for the entire continental U.S. Much of the inputs needed for these raw thermal-based models are also easily obtainable from Landfire, so it's really a great platform. So as we can all imagine, fuels are an important input into these fire simulation models. So here we're going to briefly look at two examples where Landfire's fuel maps were used as input into the wildfire simulation model FlamMap to recreate some historic wildfire perimeters. Because prescribed fire in shrub steppe is, I'm not going to say frowned upon, but not frequently used, opportunities to validate these wildfire simulation models are primarily limited to, recreating these historic wildfire boundaries. And so here on the left, what we'll look at first is we've got two libraries that we're looking at here. One is the Scottenbergen 40 on the far left, and then here on the right of it, just to the right of it, is the Anderson 13. Both very similar libraries, both stylized versions. Both of these fuel layers came directly from Landfire. And so what we're looking at here, the combination of green and red, is the simulated fire perimeter here. And the combination of blue and green is the actual observed fire perimeter. So we can see the resulting spread patterns left much to be desired for the Scottenberg 40. Similarly, for the Anderson 13, where the simulated spread vastly underestimated the actual observed spread patterns of this wildfire. So this case study came from southern Idaho. Over on the far right, we have another case study from Boulder County, Colorado, where Krasnow essentially did the same thing using Landfire and FlamMap to attempt to recreate a couple of historic wildfire perimeters, and the results were similar, where here you can just faintly see it outlined in white, these two fire perimeters, and then the resulting simulated fire perimeter here in the black. But in both of these cases, simulation agreement was significantly improved through the development of locally adapted fuels maps informed by either field data or remotely sensed data. So this is not meant to be a knock on Landfire. Landfire is an amazing product. Not many places in the world have this type of data or that type of data freely available to them, but the issue here is scale. Landfire is produced at a national level, but almost all land management is occurring at scales less than 1 million acres, and this is kind of what's driving our work forward, is this need to more effectively produce locally adapted fuels maps for use in these wildfire simulation models. So our group, in collaboration with the Bureau of Land Management, developed this fuels photo guide, which enables the quick and confident assignment of fuel types to study plots in the field. So these fuel assignments can then be combined with other field data or remotely sensed data to produce these locally adapted fuel maps. And if this is interesting to you, this product is conveniently housed on the Great Basin Fire Exchange's website, if anyone is interested. So just to kind of further highlight the need for these locally adapted fuel maps, here we're going to quantify mismatches in fuel assignments at Craters of the Moon National Monument Preserve in southern Idaho. So here on the left, we've got number of plots, and then along the bottom axis, we've got these different fuel types, and purple is what is observed in the field, yellow is the associated Landfire classification. And what we can see kind of right away is that there's very little agreement amongst any of the fuel models between the field and the remotely sensed or the Landfire estimate. But especially here, this 122 fuel model, which is a grass shrub fuel type that our group was largely characterizing as either shrub dominated or grass dominated. So then we can, moving forward, we can then look at the resulting differences in wildfire risks that these mismatches create. So on the far left, we've got wildfire risk simulations done in FlamMap using Landfire as the fuels input. Here in the middle, using our field-based inputs, and then on the right, the normalized difference between those two. And so highlighted in red are areas where Landfire is overestimating risk, and areas in blue are where Landfire is underestimating risk. And so the point to be made here is that if we are going to use simulated wildfire risk to inform treatment placement, then we need to make sure that those inputs are locally grounded. Otherwise, treatments may be poorly placed or prioritized, such as in this case here. So I've mentioned issues with scale a few times already with respect to management, but what I kind of want to talk about now is the processes that we are talking about, such as wildfire, which is moving and operating at these very fine scales. So we kind of live in a 30-meter world, or we've been living in a 30-meter world. But like I said, those ecological and physical processes that we're concerned about here are occurring at much smaller scales. And so if the goal is to simulate wildfire as realistic as possible to reliably inform treatment prioritization, then finer resolution inputs are needed. So thankfully, with the emergence of new remote sensing products such as SuperDove and Worldview, which are providing imagery now at resolutions less than 3 meters, and the addition of some of these deep learning models, which enable us to more effectively classify images Here in this example, we are using sub-meter NAPE imagery, 0.6 meter NAPE imagery, and a deep learning model basically to downscale our 30-meter product, our 30-meter field validated product, to something that is much higher resolution, much more accurately reflects what is on the landscape, and then should much more accurately reflect the way the wildfire actually moves through this landscape. So I think I went a little quick, John. I'll give you some time back. Thanks a bunch, everyone.
No, that's great. Thank you. That was very on time. I do not see any questions in the chat, but I was wondering, you mentioned the availability of a tool to help do some locally based modeling, a locally adapted fuel mapping. And I wondered, does that require a fair amount of expertise, or can anyone just get in there and pick it up and do a decent job, or do you need to
So I
hire
may
someone?
have referred to it as a tool, I guess. Essentially, the process is we are collecting field data and the associated vegetation information, and then we're using that information in machine learning models to then classify pixels to
Okay.
fuel models. So we're producing these maps. I think that there is some development of tools to streamline that process. Maybe Matt can give you a little bit more information on that.
Yeah, Jake, you didn't call it a tool. I think I heard it in my head that way. So that's good to know, though. Thank you.
Yeah, it would
All
be a
right.
great tool.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And with that, we'll move on to Matt Germino, who's going to talk about effectiveness of layering treatments in response to wildfire and sagebrush. I see you, Matt. I now see
Okay,
slides.
good to go.
Yep, take it away.
So consider for just a moment here, if annual grasses never increased at the expense of perennials after wildfire, we probably wouldn't be trapped in having this grass fire feedback cycle. And so management of freshly burned areas is absolutely critical in the nation's effort to break the grass fire cycle. One of the key things that I've seen over my now long career here in the U.S. Geological Survey in the Department of Interior is that there's constantly new tools or silver bullets that are presented to us as things that can save the day. But I want to emphasize to you all that I think it's extremely unlikely that we're ever going to have a singular silver bullet solution to such a wicked problem as the grass fire cycle. Instead, we're going to need multiple tools that address both the causes and the symptoms. And we need those tools to work in harmony and to possibly have synergy if possible, but at minimum to not be counterproductive. And this seems like common sense, and like, why would we even need a study on it? But it turns out it's actually fairly challenging to do. It's also pretty challenging for me to advance my slides. Let's see. Frozen.
Maybe did the arrow buttons work?
Nope. Odd. Okay, click in, punch,
Try hitting
arrows.
that hide button on that thing. I don't know if that'll help, but it'll help us see your slides. This worked great when we did the TAC test, everyone. So
Oh, geez.
there we
Wow,
are.
that was weird. That just shot me to the end of the presentation.
All right. It looks like you got it working now.
Okay, so some acknowledgments here. Many people, including you, John, have contributed to this effort. This is one of the longest standing projects in the SURF program. It actually predates the SURF program. And it took a village, it's taking a village, and we're not quite done with this. This is a multi-decadal research question in terms of coming up with answers. And here's why. Consider, if you will, that the treatments that we have that are used on the landscape are quite diverse. And some of them, we don't even really think of treatments, but did you know that the most extensive and most commonly used post-fire treatment in the world and in the US is deferment of livestock grazing. And livestock grazing occurs in so many different ways, shapes, and forms, and it can be resumed in so many different ways, shapes, and forms. And so figuring out how is it that we can work with grazing resumption or tools such as herbicides that can knock back the invaders like cheatgrass or medusa head or secondary forb invaders, or the many different ways that we can try to seed or plant desirable perennials to restore them. All of these, mind you, done with the singular objective of restoring the perennial bunch grasses that we've seen over and over and over again to be absolutely essential to rebuilding resistance to reinvasion and resilience to disturbance and the beneficial interactions between resistance and resilience. So many different ways that all of these can be combined and used. And so the trick is that if you put seeds in the ground, well, if you're using pre-emergent herbicides, which will selectively disadvantage any annual species that needs to germinate every year in order to sustain its population, then those pre-emergent herbicides are probably going to have some sort of an effect or at least a risk factor for damaging the seeds that you put into the ground. And cows love tasty young perennial grasses, and their impacts can diminish the benefits of either seeding or herbicide. So how do you combine all these different things? This is the key question. We have tried so many times to glean the answers from the literature. And in fact, one of the prior SURF projects, one that concluded last year, led by Lee Benyon and a crew of us, discovered that, well, the literature is actually pretty challenging to glean unified, simple answers to these questions from. And part of that is because the many different studies out there, there's actually 3,000 studies that we pulled, only about 38 of which had good enough geographic information and treatment information and reporting results for us to actually do an analysis on them. So, and then when we did that, you can see pretty muddy results like herbicides. Yes, so annual grasses reduced by imazapic. Of course, you would expect that. And seeding, yes, sometimes you can get an enhancement of desirable perennials. But really, the only insight we really got was that, well, if you combine seeding and herbicide over many different studies, you tend to get a better outcome for reestablishing those perennials that give you resistance and resilience, and at the same time that gives you a longer term knockback of those exotic annual grasses. This is a win right here. But what I want to emphasize is when you do the meta-analysis, gosh, it's so muddy and very difficult to apply the findings to any particular site that a manager might be managing. So the whole objective of this project is to really drill down and have very tight experimental control at the landscape, at the management scale of what are the outcomes of your different options for combining herbicides, drill seeding, and different ways of grazing resumption. Key challenge is getting appropriate controls at the landscape level from managers' treatments. So yeah, we're using management trials. And in each one of these management trials, we have grazing exposures. Inside the grazing exposures, we do clipping. The exposures cross active restoration treatments. And we have a typical set of things that we measure in great detail. Many plots, veg cover, density, basal grass diameters, how big are the grasses, and how big are the gaps in between your large stature perennial grasses. So my favorite wildfire ever, the one that is very best studied on Earth, the 2015 Soda wildfire, one of the outcomes of this SURF program, has the best documentation and dispersion of many different herbicide, drill seeding, and other kinds of treatments. Perfect study case. We can learn a lot from these as if they are treatments fairly similar to what a scientist might lay out on the ground. However, with livestock, we didn't have collars, and we thought we could learn from differences in the way livestock were grazing was resumed for each of the 105 pastures across these 300,000 acres. Turned out not to be the case. Cows are super selective in where they use the landscape. You don't know exactly where the cow is. You're not really going to get a good passive study. So here's where you can see the exposures. So the first thing we learned is, like our meta-analysis showed, that the combination of drill seeding and herbicide gives you a much better outcome where and when you have some depletion of perennials and you have threshold-like levels of exotic annual grasses. Here's a year since fire. So 20% annual grass cover is considered by many, but not all managers, to be a threshold. You get much more than that, you're really likely to see a trend towards annual grassland. Same thing with perennial bunch grasses. I'd like to see those over 20% if possible. Sandberg bluegrass was a real surprise here. So we want to have less than 20% annual cover and more than 20% perennial bunch grass cover. In this graph, that gets you into the green room. So for those of you that are into whitewater or surfing, green room is a good place to be, unless you're stuck in it. And so here what you can see is that, first of all, considering this non-seeded, sometimes neglected native really was pivotal for this analysis. But really the most important thing to see here is that, herbicide after the first winter, treated versus untreated. So treating greatly knocks back your annuals, a little bit of release of perennials, not so much. Herbicide the first year followed by drill seeding. Now we're starting to see a big increase in the perennials and a pretty strong knockback in exotic grasses. And even using the opposite combination tended to be pretty good. There's some pictures to show that. Herbicide with the seeding, bingo, we like it. John, I'm going to go over just a minute if you don't mind. So here's, now let's layer in the grazing. So this is what the treatment array looked like, very significant. Surprisingly, we found if you compare these treatments to controls, exotic annual grasses, litter, perennial bunch grasses, and sandberg bluegrass, only effects here really were a little bit in litter and a bump up in perennial grasses or knockback in perennial grasses with fall clipping. Contrary to that, we saw a massive effect of drill seeding, and drill seeding strongly affected the resilience to post-fire grazing. And there's some pictures of it. So combination of herbicide and seeding, superior. Mazopic is great. Then you can drill seed. You can follow up later with Rejuva, a longer lasting pre-emergent herbicide. Pay attention to sandberg bluegrass, and your style of grazing resumption really does matter. And I wish we had a lot more information on that to give to you. We are very committed to continuing research on this. Managers are already using this info. It's already been used to guide grazing resumption decisions and tune these multiple overlay problems. There you go.
Thanks, Matt. That was great. Appreciate it. It looks like there's a question in the chat that asks, when you speak about seeding in general in your table on observed outcome, do you refer only to drill seeding? And how does drill seeding compare to aerial seeding?
So first of all, aerial seeding of perennial grasses. So my talk was mainly focused on building resistance and resilience, which is pretty much about getting your perennial bunch grasses back on the landscape. It's not as much about getting sagebrush or other fire-sensitive forbs back in. So aerial seeding is generally low yield. So most of the strong outcomes that we've seen, and we've seen plenty, have come from drill seeding. So most of what I was talking about in this presentation was drill seeding. And it varied as to whether or not it was done with a minimum till drill seeding on soft soils, or whether it was done with a conventional drill with, claws that rip the soil disking, and intensive soil disturbances.
Thanks, Matt. Well, it's really cool that we're still continuing to get lessons learned out of that soda fire landscape and the tremendous amount of effort that was put into really turning that into a research landscape. So appreciate the long-term work that you've been doing out there. It's been great. At this point, I think we're going to go ahead and turn this into kind of a panel discussion. So I'll invite all of our speakers to come on camera if they'd like. And I think Janae has a question she can start off with that she received.
Yeah, this question I think was directed for you, Seth, but anyone can answer. The question that many have is how to determine what each fuels treatment consisted of and how the various methods are successful or not. Of course, that depends on the location and habitat type and condition, but some general trends for a habitat location might be known. Um, that's the first question. And then I'd really like to hear about nature-based solutions to treating fuels, such as early season livestock grazing, which you were touching on, Matt. I've had success with goat grazing project in Montana, and how does that compare to other fuels management methods?
Okay, that's some questions. I'd be happy to chip off the latter question about the grazing.
Yeah, go ahead, Matt, and then we'll come back to that first question. Maybe you can repeat it, Janae, after Matt answers it.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. So some livestock operators have done pretty well with targeted grazing, but there's many examples where it didn't pan out super well. The trick is that the operator has to have good control of the animals, and you kind of have to be like a farmer in a way. The problem with these annual grasses and even the perennial bunch grasses is that they're so tuned into weather, especially cheatgrass, right? And if you want to try to use grazing or any kind of mowing to affect the current year's crop in ways that can reduce your fuels, you have to be very skillful and committed to getting the animals on the plants at the right time. And then we have to keep in mind, that probably at least some part of our problem is actually due to livestock in the first place. It's inappropriate livestock grazing practices, and we have to acknowledge that we're still learning what is the best grazing regime. So, we're aiming for a moving target on this question of targeted grazing.
Thanks, Matt. So, Seth, I think the first part that Janae had asked was put in the chat. I don't know if you saw it, but
Yeah, I can see the chat.
Okay.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so with regard to how to determine what each fuel treatment consisted of, that we get from working with our land management partners. So there are records like the Land Treatment Digital Library where you can glean that information. But we work directly with in the example I gave with the Fort Huachuca forester and then some of his staff to determine what exactly they did in the field with regard to the fuels treatment. So that's how we got that information. If you don't know the fuels treatment, you obviously know the Land Treatment Digital Library is a resource. There are other ways of reconstructing what was done if you don't know exactly what was done. And then I think the second part is how to determine whether the methods are successful. And so you're correct in that there are a lot of different ways of looking at fuel treatment effectiveness. The way we've taken is whether they reach their target reduction in fuels and the configuration of fuels. So we again work with them to figure out what their goal actually was. But then in the other example I gave, we actually use fire modeling to actually simulate fire behavior. So we can look to see if the fuel treatments mitigate, fire behavior that you wouldn't want, a transition to canopy fire, torching, that kind of thing that isn't wanted in the landscape. And so there are other ways to approach it, but those are the two ways that we've taken it on.
Thanks, Seth. So I've got a slightly more philosophical question. When trying to synthesize information across geographies and time, we're clearly challenged to draw, consistent conclusions and recommendations. And Matt, of course, you were speaking about this in general. So is there something that we can be doing with our monitoring or otherwise to really help overcome this? Or are there just ecological systems like the ones we work in that are just too variable to find restoration silver bullets?
Yeah, so let's talk about the first thing. And since I'm a scientist, I can say that us scientists have been a little naughty and not good enough at reporting the geographic locations of our studies. So in our meta-analysis, we wanted to extract out like soils and climate information for each study plot in the many different studies we collated, but we couldn't because too many times, the researchers might have done something like had huge treatments over a huge area, and then they give you one GPS point, and that GPS point, by the way, has like 5 decimal points accuracy on it, a resolution. It's like, all right. And then in other cases, it's just not reported at all. It just says, the plots were near some town or something, and so you can never really, only in a few cases where you were given polygons in the supplemental data or directly from if you can email the authors and get the polygons, then you could know. So that's the first thing, is that and John, you're on the funding end of science. So one thing that people like you can do is be like, hey, we ask and actually expect of you as federal scientists to really think about what is the complete set of information that people will need in 5, 10, 15 years from now to actually use your data, for these critical meta-analysis questions.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing we need right now. Believe it or not, there's like this incredibly simple but very prohibitive issue with how we have not fully reported everything that needs to be known. I forgot the second part of your question.
Well, I'll just open up to anyone else who wants to take that on, and it's just this idea of trying to get to more consistent recommendations. And is it possible, or is it just too complicated to really get there? People want, the thing to do for post-fire restoration or for improving ecological integrity. So anyone wants to come off camera? Yeah, Cara, please go ahead.
Well, one of the things I was just thinking about actually as you're talking through this is I think that we do a lot of work with trying to relate these metrics that are measured on like broad scales. Like we use DayMet data that is measured on a 1 kilometer scale, or we use the soil maps that are really pretty coarse and not resolute. And I just think a lot of what we are missing is kind of understanding the microsite metrics that we might need to measure to actually understand how like a very specific area is going to react and what the variability may be there. And I think we are still a long ways away from understanding that, and we need to do a lot more research on like understanding what those really small scale metrics are that actually create the variability that creates such differences in the way that the treatments work across the landscape. Because like over and over again, we just see these studies where it's just like we just fail to connect these really broad scale metrics to what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah, core scale information to answer fine scale questions, which leads me to something else I was thinking about and bringing it back to the 3D modeling for fuels. I'd love to hear some more thoughts from those of you that can offer them on what what other improvements and how you see it. And Cara, I'll start with you because you had mentioned at the end of your talk that 3D model fuels models will help with the analysis work you're doing. So
yeah, and that's kind of going to be the next step in a lot of this fire modeling, because I mean I did allude to some of the issues with it that we're really dealing with, like pretty coarse ways of actually modeling this. So the 3D physics-based models will take into consideration the heights of the vegetation, which probably really controls like what your flame lengths are and how the fire spreads and all that stuff. yeah, just this different structure of the plants, like how the leaf arrangements are and all of that, will probably get us much closer to actually representing how fire does move across the landscape. The major limitations to it so far is that because it's very computationally intensive, it's really difficult to model very large areas at all. But I mean, our computation power is something that's definitely increasing greatly. And so hopefully we'll be able to get at that a lot better. We have a big project that is going to be across a bunch of Department of War landscapes, where we're going to be collecting LiDAR information, fuel models, and basically is trying to create crosswalks between the older, coarser fire behavior fuel model types, and then hopefully what we'll use in the future, which will be the fuel typing for these 3D models that include the vertical structure and all that.
And I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that. Yes.
Yeah, just John, to your earlier question, one thing that we've done here that I'll put in the chat is I know there's similar efforts in Sage Country, but we have a restore net or experimental network of sites where we perform restoration in a similar way across environmental gradients, so we can determine whether it's a one size fits all. So certain treatments we've tested do work well broadly across the gradient, whereas other treatments need to be fine-tuned to the soils and other site conditions. And so I think one thing that's cool about that, you as managers do this all the time, where you're kind of experimentally testing things at a small scale before you actually need to implement them at a large scale. I think there's several examples of that, and I think that's kind of an ideal way of doing it. So it's low risk and you can really tweak things to get them dialed in before you have a big disturbance. With regard to the 3D fire modeling, in addition to what Cara said, I think another thing that's lacking in our 2D models is the exchange between, the land and atmospheric conditions. So like things like wind move through the vegetation, which we're totally ignoring in 2D models. So understanding the structure of the vegetation and how wind moves through it and is either retarded or accelerated, I think is an important thing to bring into the models. And then, one thing I kind of tried to illustrate on one of my slides was, again, that transfer from kind of a low intensity surface fire to getting up into canopies and becoming a crown fire, which I think if you're thinking about sagebrush systems, getting up into the crowns of the sagebrush and having a wind carried fire that just moves through, not everywhere that can happen, but understanding when that could happen, I think is another thing you could address in 3D fire modeling.
Cool. Well, that's hopeful. That I think that all of that sounds like it's pointing towards improvements and ability to predict and manage what might happen on the landscape. Which brings me to kind of the last question, which is really just thinking about, all of these talks at some level are dealing with risk management on the landscape. So risk from soil moisture deficits, risks of burning or reburning or loss of investment from restoration. So what advice or recommendations would you have for managers to help try and understand and balance that risk, but also feel like they have some degree of expertise in science to help back up the decisions that they have to make in face of that risk? Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Well, I think the first thing, and this is a take-home message for the entire session, is that any treatment intervention is an experiment because we have incomplete knowledge. We especially have we have some ability to generalize information, just enough to get us going, but we're dealing with such a vast and varied landscape. Yeah, it's all, a lot of it's sagebrush steppe, but sagebrush steppe, it occurs from areas that get as little as 150 millimeters of rain a year to areas that get 450. And that is right along the inflection of how biomass relates to annual precipitation. So in a way, sagebrush steppe, it's not a sea, it's It's not homogeneous. It's incredibly varied, and therefore, um, what researchers hope is that the managers can become OCD in learning about their site, talking to the managers that preceded them, and bugging people like Seth and Cara and myself to to ask questions and engage us in the learning, and then to appreciate that everything they do, whether it's an active treatment or a decision not to act, that is an impactful decision. It's an experiment. And so the most important thing we need to do is to keep learning for the sake of the particular management unit, but also for the broader sake of creating generalized information. That's the number one thing that we can do. And in this age of like AI and all this stuff, like the learning, our ability to synthesize and learn it's going to accelerate really quickly. So if we can engender this philosophy and attitude and mindset, I think we could actually see some pretty nice dividends in short order. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Anyone else with some thoughts on how to face risk and in the context of maybe what you were talking about? Adam, I don't know if you have anything related to soil moisture and how that can figure in or should figure into decision making.
That's a good question. I feel like soil moisture is very fickle and depends on so many things that have already been mentioned here. I feel like anytime you remove biomass to try and change soil moisture one way, maybe increase its availability for the vegetation that's remaining, you might need to also pay attention to how you're changing solar inputs, changing wind inputs, changing precip inputs, and just understanding that the system can change in many ways pretty quickly. So maybe what Matt suggested as well is keep on learning and do small adjustments, always experiment with your site and keep journaling the info of what you change in your system. Yeah.
Thanks. Cara?
I think part of the impetus for this whole reburn project that I did was kind of working with risk and understanding, because I think that there's been a lot of effort to be like try to restore back to what we had before and like hope that it doesn't reburn again. Where in reality, it's just like a lot of these systems are in a much more frequent fire cycle. They were already into that, like trying to resist that change in a lot of areas is not really going to be possible. And so like if you are dealing with an area where you're seeing a lot of reburns, kind of accepting a directed state change into maybe a perennial grassland that does reburn frequently but is able to withstand that reburning can come back might be a better option than trying to get it back to what it was before, failing, and then it just goes to invaded grass state, basically.
Yeah, thanks. Anything from Seth or Jake? No, you don't have to, but want to offer? All right. Well, I want to say thank you for each of you for sharing what you brought today. We really appreciate it. These are, again, a great opportunity for all of you to share the important research work that you're doing, and particularly this actionable science that's really intended to help the management audience that's joined us as well. And I want to thank all of you for being here as well. With that, I will hand it over to Janae for some final thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to all the attendees for the great questions, and thanks to all the presenters for sharing your research. Super informative. When the webinar closes, there will be a 3-question survey. So please take that. It really helps us put on more of these research sharing events. And the webinar recording, when it's available, it will probably be a couple weeks, but I'll post that and I'll send the link out to everyone who is registered. So thank you all again for your participation. And yeah, thanks. This has been a great series. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.